The year is 1944. In the hazy highlands of northeast India, where the mountains tower up against the sky and the air smells like pine and dirt after rain, there lies a peaceful town. It is called Kohima. Before the war, not many people in the West had heard of it. But in the months to come, this faraway region would be the site of one of the most terrible battles of World War II. It was so desperate and brutal that veterans would later nickname it the Stalingrad of the East. We start our trip into that long-lost struggle tonight. Find a place where you can relax, take a deep breath, and let the tale flow. Kohima was not a big city. It wasn't a stone castle or the capital of an empire. It was a little hill station on peaks that were more than a mile above sea level. The roads were tortuous, and the buildings were made of wood and tin. For most people, it didn't matter. But for the British, Indian, and Japanese soldiers, Kohima was the key to getting into India. In 1944, the Japanese had a big dream: to invade India via Burma, start a rebellion against the British, cut off the Allies' supply routes to China, and go deep into the heart of South Asia. They needed one path for this dream to come true: the road that went through Kohima. We need to envision the geography in order to understand the war. Narrow mountain paths led west from Burma to the plains of India. The most crucial of these roads went via Kohima and on to the bigger city of Imphal, where the British had established airfields, supply depots, and command posts. If the Japanese could take Kohima, they could cut off Imphal's supply lines and open the way for their big invasion. This lonely hill village held the fate of a whole theater of war, and maybe even the fate of British India. The Japanese army still controlled Burma in early 1944, but their hold was under danger. Allied forces were starting to push back, thanks to extensive air routes and help from rebels in the jungle. The Japanese started what they called the Yugo offensive to take the lead. 3 divisions marched west, over jungles and mountains, with orders to attack Imphal and Kohima. Their leaders promised a clear triumph that would end British rule in Asia. Their men, who had been fighting for years, marched with confidence. But they didn't realize how hard it would be. The terrain, the distance, the supplies, and the guys who wouldn't give up. At first, it looked like Kohima was just lightly held. British and Indian forces, many of whom were from tiny garrisons and logistics groups rather than combat divisions, defended it. Some were clerks, drivers, and supply officers, men who had been taught to work, not fight. But as the danger escalated, more troops started to show up. Some of them were British 2nd Division battalions and Indian regiments that had already fought the Japanese in the tough jungles of Burma. They understood how good the enemy was at sneaking in, how dangerous it was to attack at night, and how brutal jungle fighting was. They were ready to fight not just for Kohima, but also for the road that would decide the campaign. The Japanese thought the advance was both brave and foolish. Their supply lines were weak over the mountains, and they had to rely on mules, porters, and whatever food they could find along the way. They believed in speed and surprise. They thought the British would give up before they attacked. They didn't think that this small hill station, Kohima, would hold up. Dear listener, before we go into battle, let's take a moment to think about why the Battle of Kohima is important. It wasn't the biggest fight of the war. It didn't have hundreds of thousands of men or the sound of thousands of tanks, but it was important. The Japanese assault into India was stopped in Kohima. The tide in Burma started to change in Kohima. Also in Kohima, British and Indian men fought together in a battle of endurance that changed the course of Asia's history. The memory stayed with those who lived. The ridges of Kohima were the last site of rest for many who fell. So, in March 1944, the hills around Kohima became tense and quiet. Villagers saw groups of soldiers moving through woodlands and along ridges. Officers looked at maps and sent messages that were very important. Supply lines were stretched thin, and airfields were busy. The storm was on its way. Kohima would face unimaginable bombing, siege, hunger, hand-to-hand warfare, and sacrifice in the days to come. But no one could see the full extent of what was about to happen on that tranquil night. We'll go deeper into the storm's center in the upcoming chapter. We shall watch as the Japanese move forward, the siege surrounding Kohima gets tighter, and the defenders make a last stand. Let's hold on to this vision tonight. A calm town in the high hills of India that doesn't know what's about to happen to it. The storm had come by the beginning of April 1944. The Japanese 31st Division, which had been fighting for years, marched through the forest and up the slope with weapons, mortars, and hopes of winning. They were going to Kohima, a little town on a ridge. Their job was to cut off the route to Imphal, block the Allied soldiers, and open the door to India. And so the siege began. The Japanese moved forward. Picture them now. Thousands of Japanese soldiers making their way across the mountains. Their boots were worn down by mud and stones, and their outfits were wet by mist and rain. They didn't bring much food with them since their generals thought they could survive off the land and get what they needed from villages along the road. Their leaders talked about fate and how they would strike a blow so hard that Britain would fall and India would rise up against them. Kohima wasn't merely a military goal for these troops. It stood for ambition, empire, and the hope of winning in Asia. British and Indian soldiers at Kohima got ready for the storm. Some of them were guys from the Assam Regiment, who were local hill fighters who knew the area well. There were also groups of Royal West Kents, clerks and service personnel who were forced to fight, and officers who had just gotten there. They built trenches along the ridges, added wood and sandbags to bunkers to make them stronger, and set up lines of fire, but there weren't many defenders. They recognized that their numbers were weak when facing a full Japanese division, but they also understood they had to hold the road behind them, the route to Imphal, at all costs. The first bullets were fired in early April. Japanese scouts snuck through the bush to see how strong the British lines were. There were small fights on the slopes, with guns cracking in the fog and mortars thumping in the distance. The Japanese artillery soon commenced fire, sending rounds crashing into the ridges and shaking the earth and breaking trees. The bombardment was both scary and unbelievable for the defenders. This tranquil hill station, which used to be a peaceful place to relax, now roared with the sound of combat. The Japanese had finished surrounding the area by April 5th. Kohima was cut off. The garrison, which was only a few thousand men strong, couldn't get any more troops. There weren't many supplies. There wasn't much ammunition. Soon there wouldn't be enough food. The defenders could only use what they had brought with them and what could be airlifted in. Every bullet, every ration, and every gallon of water would be important. But morale stayed high. The men knew what to do. Hold Kohima until someone else came to help. To picture the siege, think of life crammed into small trenches and foxholes. Men crouched under tarps to keep dry, ate cold food, and listened for footsteps in the dark. Every night, tiny Japanese groups tried to get in by throwing grenades and yelling in the dark. Every day there was shelling, sniper fire, and the constant anxiety of being attacked. There wasn't much sleep. Hunger grew. And still, the defenders held on. The siege was hard on the Japanese soldiers as well. Their supply routes were stretched thin across the mountains. There wasn't much food. A lot of people marched with only a few grains of rice each day. Malaria, diarrhea, and weariness spread among them. But discipline kept them together. Their leaders told them that Kohima was the most important place in India, that they would break the British Empire here on this ridge. They were told to keep going and take the town at whatever cost. The deputy commissioner's bungalow was in the middle of Kohima. It was a colonial home with gardens and a tennis court around it. This little piece of land, no more than a few dozen yards, will eventually be known as one of the most renowned battlefields of the war. British and Japanese forces fought over this land for days and nights, throwing grenades and firing rifles at each other across a territory little bigger than the length of a tennis match. Men dug in on both sides of the court, so close that they could hear each other's voices, smell the smoke from the enemy's cooking, and feel death only a few yards away. This is a small version of the siege of Kohima, frantic, close, and never-ending. The siege got worse as the days went on. The defenders got weaker as the shell fire hit their trenches and their food ran out. Medics labored non-stop to care for wounded guys who were lying in makeshift shelters. There wasn't enough ammunition, so every round was fired with care. The Japanese also had problems. Their attacks cost a lot of lives, with bodies laying all over the slopes and stretcher bearers going quietly through the night. They lost hope of an easy win when they saw that the defenders would not give up. British and Indian troops were on their way to breach the siege. They were moving and fighting through the highlands. Every day and every hour, the soldiers in the fortress listened for the sound of guns coming closer and for the glimmer of hope beyond the ridges. They could only wait till that moment came. Dear listener, picture yourself in the trenches. Think about the wet air, the smell of gunpowder, the cries of the injured, and the constant sound of guns. Think about how long you would have to wait for help that hasn't come yet. In April 1944, this was the life of the people who defended Kohima, a small group of soldiers surrounded by thousands, holding on to hope atop a hill in the highlands. In the following episode, we shall see the siege at its worst. Hand-to-hand fighting, fighting for every inch of territory, and the pain that made Kohima one of the war's most terrible engagements. Again, close your eyes and envision the ridges of Kohima in April 1944. The fog is low over the hills. There are a lot of bugs in the jungle, and in the trenches dug into the red dirt, soldiers stand with their guns at the ready, their eyes straining to see in the dark. The siege has started, but now it would turn into something else. Not just a lot of bombs, not just a standoff. Kohima was poised to become a crucible, a place where men fought each other in the closest, most desperate way possible. The deputy commissioner's bungalow had a little garden and tennis court in the middle of the siege. To others who didn't live there, it was merely a piece of land where families used to play and flowers used to grow. But to the soldiers on both sides, it became the war's focus. The British and Indian defenders constructed shallow trenches on one side of the tennis court. On the other hand, the Japanese dug in so close that at night they could hear whispered commands and even men coughing. How far apart are the two sides? Not more than 30 yards. In some regions, not as much. It was like trench warfare on a small scale, with two armies glaring at each other across the length of a tennis match, each waiting for the other to give in. The fighting got worse at night. Japanese soldiers snuck forward in the dark and threw grenades into the British trenches. The defenders threw explosives back across the court in response. The blasts shook the night and echoed across the ridge like thunder. In those hours, instinct was the only thing that could keep you alive. It would take men only a few seconds to grab a live grenade and throw it back. Some people didn't have time, and the explosion killed them where they were. But even as men fell, others stepped in to take their place. Neither side would give in. When explosives and bullets didn't work, the fight shifted to knives, bayonets, and fists. Imagine this: two troops bumping into each other in the dark, guns clanging and bayonets gleaming in the low light of flares. A push, a scream, and one falls. Another jumps into the trench and swings his weapon as the guys fight in the mud. These fights didn't involve big moves or plans that covered a lot of ground. They were fights of inches and yards between tired soldiers in the darkness of the ridge. The deputy commissioner's garden, which used to be full of flowers, was now full of bodies. Every tree, bush, and wall became a hiding place for snipers and machine gunners. Shells tore the ground apart, and craters filled with blood and wetness. The air smelt of cordite, burning, and death. Once proud soldiers now crawled through dirt, their faces dirty and their hands holding guns that were covered in muck, and the fighting carried on anyhow. The pressure on the garrison never let off. Japanese gunfire hit the ridges day after day, destroying bunkers and shattering trenches. Mortars moaned above, hitting supply dumps and assistance stations. The defenders had to share their food, which included biscuits, canned meat, and tea when they could. There wasn't enough water, so it had to be hauled up in buckets while under fire. Each bullet was valuable, and each shot was fired with care. There was no way to sleep. Men nodded out for a few minutes, their heads resting on their guns, and then they were jerked awake by the following attack. But the Japanese also had to deal with horrific things. Their supply lines went across the mountains, and their food was running out. Soldiers regularly struggled for small amounts of rice, which made them weak from hunger and disease. But they didn't give up. They thought this ridge was the key to India, so they kept attacking it with bravery and commitment, even as they lost more men. They couldn't even think about giving up. There had no other choice but to win or die. There were several brave gestures among the defenders. Even when surrounded, soldiers kept their ground. Medics crawled through the flames to get to the hurt. Officers encouraged men with calm words, steady hands, and a strong will. One British officer said, "We were so close to the enemy that we could hear them talking. Everything smelled like death. But we kept going because we had no other choice." Courage was everywhere for the Japanese as well. Men ran through gunfire, carrying just rifles and bayonets, and threw themselves at bunkers with grim determination. They fought with the same determination they had showed all over Asia, unyielding, persistent, and brave. Kohima had become a battlefield of inches by the middle of April. There was a fight over every trench, bunker, and piece of ground. Some positions changed hands more than once in a single day. A bunker taken at sunrise could be lost by noon, retaken by midnight, and lost again by morning. It cost blood to buy each yard of earth. But the line held. The garrison of Kohima refused to give up, even though they were tired, hungry, and under constant attack from heavy artillery. Dear listener, think about how hard it is. Imagine crouching in a trench and hearing the shells whistle, the rifles crack, and the injured scream. Think about how tired you are, how hungry you are all the time, and how scared you are that the next attack could be your last. And you still have to stand. You have to keep fighting, though. You still have to stay the course. And so, the Kohima Crucible kept burning. Men fought each other in the closest way possible, on ridges, in gardens, and on tennis courts. They were trapped in a fight that seemed to go on forever. Kohima was more than simply a place now. It had become a symbol of two armies fighting on a lonely hillside in the hills of India, of endurance and of sacrifice. We shall talk about the fight for assistance in the future chapter. While the garrison held, British and Indian troops fought their way through jungles and mountains to breach the siege. The fate of Kohima, and maybe all of India, was in the balance. Gunfire still rang out on the slopes of Kohima. The guys in the trenches lived from minute to moment, waiting for the next shell, grenade, or desperate charge. The trenches were like wounds on the ground. But on the other side of the hills, Far away down India's twisting roadways, another narrative was happening. Men were marching to break the siege. Reinforcements, which had been long awaited, were on their way through jungles and mountains, ready to break the Japanese grasp. We will talk about that journey tonight, the drive to Kohima and the desperate fight to reach people who were surrounded. The one road that connected Imphal with Kohima was more than just a mud and stone path. It was the most important part of the British presence in northeast India. Convoys of trucks carrying food, ammo, and medical moved along it. Along it marched groups of tired but determined soldiers. If this road were blocked, Imphal would be cut off, Kohima would fall, and the Japanese could still be able to drive into India. The road became the main emphasis of the campaign, a road of survival and a path of destiny. The people defending Kohima couldn't hold out indefinitely without help. They needed soldiers, food, and guns. The British High Command then told the 2nd Division, one of Britain's best, to march to Kohima. Indian Army brigades came with them. These were men from Punjab, Gurkha regiments, and Assam. They all worked together to form the relief force, which was made up of British regulars and Indian soldiers who were all fighting for the same thing. It wouldn't be easy for them to get there. The Japanese, who knew they were coming, had set up ambushes around the mountain routes. There would be a fight over every mile of the road. Think about the land. Small roads carved into cliffs, with a steep drop on one side and a thick jungle on the other. During the day, the heat was unbearable, and at night, the cold from the high hills sunk deep into the bones. Monsoon rains transformed roads into rivers of mud, and trucks sank up to their axles. The troops moved through this carrying rifles, mortars, and heavy packs. Mules had a hard time pulling artillery pieces up hilly pathways. Engineers labored non-stop to fix roads that had been damaged by landslides and shell fire. It was hard to keep going with every step. The Japanese didn't just sit around and wait. They shot at the convoys from afar and attacked them suddenly, sliding out of the woods to cut at the columns before disappearing again. There was a lot of mortar fire on the route. There were places when fallen trees and debris blocked whole lengths of road. But the relief force kept going. Whenever there was an ambush, British and Indian forces fought back with bayonets and grenades, clearing the hills one by one. The path slowly and painstakingly opened up. The supplies were the most important part of the fight. Kohima would fall without food and bullets, but vehicles couldn't always get through, and planes had trouble landing on temporary strips. So supplies were dropped from the air. Parachutes floated down into the ridges, bringing food, ammo, and other supplies. A lot of them fell into Japanese lines and were taken prisoner before the defenders could get to them. Some fell into ravines and were never seen again. But there was enough to keep hope alive. Later, soldiers at Kohima would claim that every parachute that fell was like a promise. "We haven't forgotten you. We're coming." Every slope and hill became a battlefield, not just the route itself. Reinforcements made their way forward through a succession of brutal battles, with bayonets fixed, grenades ready, and weapons shooting until the barrels were smoking. For the Japanese, every second counted. If they could stall down the relief force long enough, Kohima might run out of food and the garrison might fall apart. They battled hard, staying in their bunkers until the last guy fell. Life was all about speed for the British and Indians. Every hour was important. Men marched till their boots bled, thinking of their friends who were stuck in the siege. Think about how tired those marches must have made you. Men staggering forward with sore feet and half-closed eyelids from being tired. The road was full of shattered cars, and the bush was full of the sound of insects and the snap of sniper fire. And yet, there were times of hope, like reading letters from home by candlelight, singing softly while men marched onwards, and seeing planes drop supplies from above. Every step they took towards Kohima brought the hope of relief and the understanding that their fight was not in vain. In the meantime, the defenders in Kohima held on to their ridges. They were hungry, tired, and under continual attack, but they still held. People muttered prayers from trench to trench, saying that the 2nd Division is coming. The road is now open. Hold on for a bit longer. These whispers made me stronger. Hope is as important in combat as food or water. The main parts of the relief force were getting closer by the middle of April. Gunfire sounded closer and closer as skirmishes broke out in the hills. And for the first time, the people defending Kohima could feel that they were not alone. The Japanese also felt the heat. Their circle of enemies got smaller, but their own supplies ran out. Their men were hungry, sickness spread, and their orders were clear. Hold Kohima, smash the resistance, and stop the aid. The road to Kohima turned to become a battlefield in its own right, a battle of endurance, logistics, and willpower. Every move the relief force made gave them hope, and every second the garrison stayed alive gave them a chance to live. In the following chapter, we'll see these two tides clash: the arrival of reinforcements, the end of the siege, and Kohima's change from a desperate defense to a counterattack that would change the course of the campaign. Almost over were the days of waiting. For the soldiers in the trenches of Kohima, who were surrounded and beaten, whispers of help coming became louder every day. They had made it through hunger, fire, and nights that seemed to last forever. Finally, the sound of fresh guns rang across the ridges. The help had finally come, and with it, the fight for Kohima would enter a new and even bloodier phase: the end of the siege. On April 18, 1944, the British 2nd Division's first troops reached the outskirts of Kohima. Their approach was defined by careful skirmishes, with Japanese snipers hiding in the undergrowth, surprise mortar bursts, and the constant worry of being ambushed. But they got closer and closer. It was like a big gloom had lifted for the folks inside Kohima. They could hear new artillery pounding across the valleys. They could see flashes of friendly weapons over the mountains. Relief was no longer just a rumor. It was genuine. Think about the time when the first soldiers from the relief force met up with the tired defenders. Men who had been under siege for weeks, their cheeks gaunt from starvation, their uniforms torn, and their eyes sunken but still full of determination. And new soldiers arrived into their ranks, carrying heavy packs with ammo, water, and medical supplies. It was a reunion of more than simply armies. It was a reunion of hope and survival. The defenders shook hands with the arrivals, smiled tiredly, and said words that were half lost in exhaustion. You came. You did it. But the Japanese did not give in. They didn't back down. Instead, they fought even harder, intending to destroy the relief army before it could fully join up with the garrison. They dug into bunkers that looked out over the road, built up their defenses with overlapping fields of fire, and counterattacked whenever they could. For them, keeping Kohima was still the most important part of their mission. If they lost it, the drive into India would collapse. And thus they held on to the peaks with a strength that even their foes were amazed by. The conflict was affected by the terrain of Kohima. The ridge was a narrow strip of land with steep slopes and not much room to move around. Attacks had to be from the front, up a hill, and against defenders hiding in bunkers. Every step forward cost lives. Artillery hit the ridge day and night, blowing up Japanese positions, breaking trees, and shaking the ground. Infantry followed with grenades, guns, and bayonets, taking out bunkers one by one. The fighting was close, nasty, and hand-to-hand. Garrison Hill, the high terrain near the deputy commissioner's home and tennis court, was the center of the struggle. It had been the focus of the siege for weeks. It was now the center of the battle for help. British and Indian troops attacked the hill over and over, but Japanese defenders always fought back. The tennis court was turned into muck, the bunkers were blown up, and the trees were left with broken stumps. Later, soldiers said that the battle here was some of the closest they had ever seen. Men were only a few yards apart, throwing grenades and insults at each other over the rubble. When the siege ended, Allied planes did their part. Fighters and bombers attacked Japanese supply lines, hit reinforcements hard, and dropped important supplies into the garrison. Parachutes opened out in the sky, bringing crates of food and ammo. For the tired defenders, seeing parachutes float down was a sign of life. For the Japanese, seeing goods fall into enemy hands was a harsh reminder of how little they had. By the end of April, the Japanese were in a bad spot. They were almost out of supplies. Soldiers ate rice, roots from the jungle, and even pieces of leather that had been boiled into broth. Disease spread without any control. The ammo ran out, but their leaders still pushed them to move forward. Orders came down. Hold Kohima, kill the rescue force, and triumph is close. And so they kept fighting, even though they were getting weaker. Dear listener, let's take a moment to think about the voices of the people who battled at this time. A British soldier wrote in his notebook, "We are so tired we can't even say how tired we are, but we can hear the guns of our own people. It is enough to keep us going." A corporal from Japan wrote in his battered notebook, "We have no food. Some of my friends are unwell and can't walk, but the authorities say we have to fight. If we don't succeed here, all is lost." These frail, genuine voices remind us that there were guys behind the plans and maps, young, scared, and determined. The siege was over. Help had come. But Kohima wasn't safe yet, and victory wasn't sure. Even though the defenders were now next to new forces from the 2nd Division, the Japanese nevertheless held on to the ridges. They fought from bunkers dug into the mountainside, foxholes protected by logs, and hillsides where every tree had become into a fort. What happened in late April and May of 1944 was not a quick win, but a long, steady effort, a fight of attrition where every inch of land cost blood. The Kohima Ridge was narrow, winding, and steep. This meant that the attackers had to attack from the front, up a hill, and against defenders with clear fields of fire. The Japanese had made thorough plans, with trenches linked by tunnels, machine gun nests disguised in the trees, and mortars aimed at the paths they would take. It took a lot of hard work to get that ground. First, the artillery would boom and shell the ridge until it looked like no one could survive. Then, the infantry would move forward, hurling grenades, shooting rifles, and charging with bayonets. But over and over again, the Japanese would come out of their bunkers, shaken but alive, ready to fight again. British and Indian gunners fired thousands of shells into the hills. The sound never stopped. It was like rolling thunder all the time. People who saw it said that trees had been stripped bare, the ground had been torn up, and whole slopes had been scorched by fire. Still, the Japanese defenses held up despite all the damage. Their shelters, which were excavated deep and strengthened with timbers, took the beating. During the shelling, the soldiers inside gathered together. When it stopped, they came out bewildered but ready to fight. The advances of infantry were hard. Platoons charged up hills while being shot at by machine guns, jumping from one cover to another, crawling through mud, and carrying the wounded behind them. Every position taken came at a cost. Troops were killed in the open, others were lost when mortars suddenly exploded, and still others died in hand-to-hand combat in bunkers. A British sergeant subsequently said, "You could smell the enemy before you saw him. Smoke, sweat, and the wet earth of the bunkers." Then the grenades would go off, and all that would be left in the world would be fire, noise, and the fight to stay alive for another minute. The Japanese weren't passive. The Allies' gains were always met with counterattacks, which often happened at night. Small groups moved through the bush, shooting guns, throwing grenades, and yelling to confuse people. They attacked supply lines, lone foxholes, and soldiers who were resting. These counterattacks rarely succeeded in taking back land, but they kept killing people and kept the Allies from resting. There was no real night for the soldiers on the queue, simply darkness full of anxiety. There were more and more deaths on both sides. The British 2nd Division lost hundreds of men in just a few weeks, and Indian troops lost a lot of men in attack after attack. The Japanese lost considerably more men, but it was tougher to replace them. Their supply lines went over mountains and were harassed by Allied planes. They were always hungry. They kept fighting nonetheless because they had orders and faith. For a lot of people, giving up was not an option. They fought till they were too weak to continue on. Listen, dear listener, to the voices that came from those weeks. It is like going to hell every day, a British officer wrote. We take a hill and lose a hill, but they still don't break. An Indian sepoy said, the ground was so close between us and them. We heard their coughs, their crying, even their pleas. It was more like a fight of wills than a battle. We were starving, a Japanese survivor said. Some males ate grass. Some fell during the march and never got back up. But we were ordered to keep Kohima. We couldn't go. The fighting for Jail Hill and GPT Ridge, two important locations that controlled the approaches, were some of the deadliest. Attacks here went on for days. Troops charged up hills while being shot at, clung to bits of cover, and dug in just a few yards from enemy bunkers. Later, prisoners talked of how determined the Japanese were. Troops who wouldn't back down and fought until grenades rolled into their positions. For the assailants, it was tiring, scary, and never-ending. Even for the Allies, who got their supplies via air, things were tough. Food was limited, and water was often hard to come by. Men fought in the heat of the day and the cold of the night in the mountains, their bodies tired, but their situation was better than that of the Japanese. Japanese soldiers frequently went days without food, eating leftovers, roots, or strips of bark to stay alive. Starvation killed them off just as quickly as gunfire. The equilibrium started to change in May. The Allies pushed aggressively with constant reinforcements. Their artillery controlled the ridge, their planes cut off Japanese supply lines, and their men learned how to charge bunkers. The Japanese grasp became weaker with time. Their defenses became weaker and their counterattacks got less frequent. They kept fighting, but things were going against them. Dear listener, think about how long these weeks have been. The sound of cannons, the snap of rifles, and the shouts in the dark. Picture climbing the same ridge over and over, knowing that friends would die, but that stopping meant failing. This was the long push at Kohima, a battle of attrition where bravery was measured not by rare moments of glory, but by the everyday endurance of terror, fatigue, and fire. In the next and last chapter, we will see the Japanese line break down, the retreat through the jungle, and the legacy of Kohima, which is acknowledged as one of the most important battles of World War II. The slopes of Kohima had turned into a graveyard by May 1944. Trees were broken, holes scarred the slopes, and bunkers were quiet where men had fought. The smell of smoke, muck, and death was thick in the air. But amidst the wreckage, the struggle had changed. The Japanese, who had earlier been sure they would win, were now falling apart. Their numbers were dwindling because of starvation, their spirits were low because of constant artillery fire, and their prospects were fading because of the inexorable advance of Allied divisions. The siege of Kohima, which was so close to success, was now ending in failure. As May came to an end, the Allied troops pushed forward with even more vigor. Their cannons roared day and night, hammering the last bunkers on the Kohima Ridge. Infantry moved forward in coordinated attacks, using grenades to remove trenches and bayonets to fight in close quarters. By the end of May, they had taken control of important places like Jail Hill, FSD Hill, and GPT Ridge. Every loss hurt the Japanese line more and more, breaking down the defense they had promised to hold. Japanese leaders finally made the choice they had been putting off for a long time, to leave Kohima on the night of May 31st. Their soldiers, many of whom were barefoot and starving, slipped into the forest, leaving behind broken positions and dead companions. The march into India and the idea of taking Imphal and Kohima had started with big hopes, but now they were backing down. The Japanese thought the Yugo onslaught had failed. When the noise stopped, it was evident how much damage had been done. Hillsides were stripped naked, houses were turned to rubble, and pits were filled with bodies. Survivors walked over the battlefield in horror, looking for friends who had died. A British 2nd Division officer subsequently said, "Kohima was a place where life seemed to hang by a thread." The silence after the battle was worse than the battle itself. The price of Kohima was outrageous. Over 4,000 British and Indian soldiers were killed or hurt. The Japanese lost considerably more people, maybe 7,000, many of whom died from disease and malnutrition, as well as from fighting. Villagers also had scars. Families were forced to leave their homes, crops were trampled, and homes were damaged. For them, Kohima wasn't just a war in the past, it was a scar on their land. Even though Kohima was a little war compared to those in Europe, it had a huge effect. The Japanese pullback ended their big attack on India. They would never again threaten to attack the subcontinent. Kohima and the engagement at Imphal at the same time were more than just a turning point in the Burma campaign. From now on, the Allies would move forward, pushing the Japanese back across Burma, opening up supply routes to China, and finally taking back Rangoon. Years later, warriors recalled Kohima not just for how violent it was, but also for how long it lasted. "We were just regular guys asked to do amazing things," stated a British soldier. "It wasn't one charge that won Kohima. It was refusing to give in day after day." An Indian sepoy said, "We fought for land no bigger than a football pitch." But that ground decided India's fate. A Japanese survivor said, "We came with dreams of victory. We fled with nothing but hunger and sadness." The conflict is still remembered today by phrases engraved into the memorial at the Kohima War Cemetery. Words that are simple but last forever. When you get home, tell them about us and say, "We gave our today for your tomorrow." This epitaph, which was said for both British and Indian soldiers, has come to stand for the sacrifice made on those hills. Historians commonly refer to Kohima as the Stalingrad of the East, not for its size, but for how intense it was, for how it changed the course of a campaign, and how hard it was to win. It was a reminder to Britain that man, not stones, held the empire. For India, it was part of a complicated history. Soldiers fighting for the British, but also building the future of their own country. Japan learnt that ambition has limitations, that going too far can cost you, and that winning without supplies is pointless. Dear listener, as we end our lengthy voyage, please envision the ridges of Kohima again. Imagine the hills covered in fog, the slopes scarred by war, and the quiet that came after. Remember the men who fought there, British, Indian, and Japanese. They were just regular guys who got caught up in amazing things. Remember the villagers who returned to reconstruct their houses among rubble. The epitaph said, "We gave our today for your tomorrow." The Battle of Kohima was not the biggest of World War II, but in its perseverance, sacrifice, and legacy, it is one of the most important. Thanks for coming along on this trip. May the story of Kohima and the men who lived through it never be forgotten. May it serve as a reminder of how much conflict costs and how important peace is. Please think about subscribing if you found this story interesting. This will let us keep studying these little-known parts of history together. Until then, get some sleep and have a wonderful night.